Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special COVID safe legal compliance webinar. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director of the law firm Kaizen Synergy, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Today's session focuses on the rolling lockdown measures that state and territory premiers have announced will be used, if required, throughout 2021. And we've already started to see that in some states already and territories, in some states and territories already this year, where short, sharp lockdowns have been a tool that various state governments have been using. Equally, as we're now having the rollouts of the COVID vaccine, there are a number of legal issues that are being raised both by employers and also employees. And we're going to actually unpack these part by part in today's webinar. It is a very much a hands-on session. If you do have any questions throughout today's session, by all means, please post those in the Q&A chat group as well too. And we will actually come to those as we move through today's session. As always, at the end of the session, we will open up the phone lines and stay online until all questions are answered. And if you are watching this webinar during a recording and published on our YouTube channel, then by all means, if you do have any questions, you can contact us around this. As always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So today's agenda, let's just walk through this. This is a two-part webinar run today and also next week. Today, we're going to be looking at the COVID plans and how agencies prepare for rolling lockdowns, because there are significant challenges that come with that. Sometimes we're only given very short notice periods, like we've seen in Victoria, where there was only last lockdown was about 6 hours notice before essentially the curfews and likes kicked in. What we're also looking at today is the HR and COVID vaccine rules for the workplace. We do recognise the Fair Work Ombudsman website as well too, where we have taken material from. So rather than reinventing the wheel, we're actually pulling relevant information from websites like the Fair Work Ombudsman website, also health departments from Commonwealth and state governments, which I will acknowledge throughout the webinar as we move through it. That said, some of the questions that come out of this is really around the operational and administrative natures of the workplace rules. And we're going to unpack a number of these areas as we actually move through today's session. We're also going to look at HR registers and workplace COVID forms. And what we mean by that is when you're looking at some of the legal compliance obligations, you obviously consider HR and fair work laws, you look at awards and enterprise bargaining agreements and the likes, and also public health legislation as well. But it's also important to look at HR registers and workplace COVID forms in order to ensure that your staff and volunteers are kept safe and also have the capacity to deliver the services that you need them to deliver and support services to clients too. So we're going to look at those and what agencies have done since February last year to actually show you what's actually working as well too, and what they've done to streamline their processes moving forwards as well. We're also then going to lead into managing your HR records, particularly in light of COVID, and also your client record systems and what information you need to hold and should be considering holding onto. And if you don't hold on to these at the moment, what you should be doing to start screening and putting systems in place. So by attending this webinar, we're hoping that you will get a number of resources coming out of this. Some of this will be around getting a better understanding of the COVID rules, improving your awareness of HR rules and what these are and how they work for your agency. You will also get a timely collection of resources, including this recording of the webinar itself, along with all of the resources we use. Our law firm has been running these webinars since February 2020 last year, and during this time onboarded over 4,000 agencies and supporting them with their relevant COVID plans and dashboards and the likes. A few housekeeping items before we move into this webinar. This webinar is being recorded all the way up to the Q&A part of the session, where we do actually turn off the recording and open up the phone lines. That's mostly just to protect people's privacy. You can ask any questions in the chat group as well too as we go through today's session. The webinar is published on the JMB 360 YouTube channel. All materials referred to will be circulated, including these slides as well too. And our knowledge base continues to grow since we've set this up back in February 2020 last year. If you do have any questions, by all means, please contact our law firm. Our contact details are listed here, along with our 1300 number and also my direct mobile number as well. Just a brief introduction, because we do have a large number of agencies again joining us for this webinar. We have run these sessions since February 2020, where they are open public forums. That said, we've onboarded just over 4,000 companies in the past year to support their COVID safe plans. With our compliance system, it is open across all agencies as well too. It has been recognised as one of Australia's leading corporate IT platforms. We have received NAIDOC awards from Aboriginal and community service organisations, as well as a range of other recognitions, including presenting at the Dubai International Emergency and Disaster Conference on pandemics and how to manage them back in 2000, so some years ago. We have our JMB 360 platform, which many of you already utilize as well too. And essentially it is mobile, which allows you to access everything from policies, HR records, COVID safe plans, and assist staff to undertake their daily screenings as they need to. So with that brief introduction, let's have a look at some of the context of the COVID safe plans and then move into very quickly the HR rules around COVID vaccines and issues that you need to consider. So essentially, when we look at this to start with, there is the need to have your COVID safe plan if you haven't had one already. It's something that Scott Morrison has put up last year. And essentially, the COVID safe plan is designed to incorporate, or should incorporate, key legislative requirements as well as government directives, also safe work checklists and the likes, and your relevant state or territory pandemic plan as well too. This should lead into some sort of self-assessment in terms of how you're tracking with this to ensure you're meeting your compliance obligations. All of these we've covered off in previous webinars. That said, on your dashboard, you do have access to your COVID safe plans and essentially are able to manage all of these reporting requirements as well. So when we look at the COVID vaccine and the workplace, what we're finding is that employers and employees are seeking clarity on their workplace rights and obligations as the vaccines become available. Now, at the moment, there isn't any public health orders in Australia that specifically enable employers to require employees to be vaccinated against coronavirus. Now, the Commonwealth does have powers in order to do this and provide directions as well too. How we think it may well be unlikely that they would go down this path, rather than having the government policy that receiving vaccination is voluntary. Ways that they've done this in the past is to provide incentives around such things as access to education and and also under MBS services too. So there are a range of, without making it mandatory, providing some sort of incentives for the same policy outcomes to be achieved. With that, there are, however, limited circumstances where agencies like yourselves may require their employees to be vaccinated. So with it, when can an employer require an employee to be vaccinated? Well, there are, and I stress this, there are currently no laws or public health orders that specifically enable employers to require your staff to be vaccinated against the coronavirus. Now, relevant factors that you should consider in this is that if there is a specific state or public health law that requires it to be vaccinated, if that comes up, whether there's any enterprise agreements, other registered agreements or employment contracts that provides or includes the provision about requiring vaccinations. And if no law or agreement or employment contract applies that requires such a vaccination, whether it would be lawful and reasonable for you to give your employees a direction to be vaccinated. Now, this is done on a case-by-case basis. And when you look at things like the Fair Work website, which is where this information has been pulled, and we're going to run commentary straight over the top of this, is that we've seen that Fair Work have said, look, you should go and get your own legal advice around this. And we've already been doing this and working through these issues with a number of agencies where employers are considering mandatory vaccinations in the workplace. And for example, this can include health and some community service agencies where they are in a high-risk environment. And such things can include where there is point-to-point contact, face-to-face contact as well too. And people might be moving and seeing a number of clients each day, or even running group classes, or you're providing services into high-risk communities like aged care or health services or Aboriginal community service agencies or NDIS services, where you are providing supports to a range of people that have been identified as vulnerable members of the community. So there are a range of specific case-by-case arrangements that you should need to consider around this. Now, when you also look at agreements or contracts relating to vaccinations, what we're finding is that some contracts and agreements may contain terms relating to vaccinations or coronavirus vaccinations specifically. Now, for example, what we're seeing is that a term relating only to flu vaccinations won't actually apply to broadly the coronavirus as well too. So in some cases, it may actually need to be quite specifically spelled out. You might also find that there are certain terms that complies with anti-discrimination laws as well too. Now, a term that is contrary to anti-discrimination laws, and I'll unpack this in the next few slides as well too, cannot actually be enforced as well too. And again, we're finding that some of these contracts and service arrangements that people have, agreements and contracts that agencies have put in have been done many years ago, and it's only now that they're actually having to look at some of these finer contract details and work out whether they are covered or not. What we have suggested to some agencies around this is also change your policy position, agency policy position. So while individual contracts and agreements may have specific clauses, often there is another part of the agreement which actually covers policies, and policies can also change too. And so what we've actually suggested to agencies is actually have a look at your COVID safe policies, look how that applies to an HR perspective, and if there are changes that you want to make across your agency, then it may well be done at the policy direct level as well. Now, some of the other questions that come out of this is, can employee and employers provide lawful and reasonable directions. Now, you can actually do this, but again, there is quite a process to actually follow. Now, whether a direction is lawful and reasonable, as Fair Work points out, has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. Now, what does this actually look like? Well, first of all, a direction to be lawful needs to comply with any contract, award, and agreement. Now, that's pretty straightforward. But the range of factors that may be relevant whether a direction is reasonable includes whether there is a practical measure to eliminate or minimize risk. You'll find that in a lot of our webinars over the past 12 months, we have focused not only on the public health legislation and changes that have occurred, but also under the work health and safety laws as well. So on its own, as pointed out by Fair Work, the coronavirus pandemic doesn't automatically make it reasonable for an employer to direct employees to be vaccinated against the coronavirus. Some circumstances may be more likely to be reasonable where, as we said, the employees interact with people with an elevated risk. Now, they've identified hotel quarantine and border control, but other more broader groups would include things like people that are vulnerable members of the community, and also health impacts to providing support services as well too. So these are the range of factors that a lot of community agencies actually do provide a broad range of services to some of the more vulnerable members of the community. So in saying that, work health and safety considerations are actually a very important factor in working out whether directions can be provided to employees. Now, that then leads into the next question of all of this is, well, what happens if an employee refuses to be vaccinated? What can we actually do? And already we've seen questions come up where someone said, well, if one person in our staffing personnel refuses to be vaccinated, can then another person who may say, well, that person causes a risk, I don't want to show up to work now as well too. So all of a sudden you start to see what we call a bit of is it a domino effect, as one of our clients put it, of saying, well, if something happens over here, it can have a knock-on effect right across the whole agency around this. And how do we actually manage this? So you can start to see some of the systems that I'm going to talk about a bit later around managing some of your legal requirements and also some of your own, what I'll call legal case files or compliance information, is now becoming important for yourselves to document this information and discussions down. Now, going back to this question, what happens if an employee refuses to be vaccinated? Well, if an employee refuses to be vaccinated, essentially, contrary to a specific law or agreement or contract, an employer should, as the first step, actually ask the employee to explain their reason for not being vaccinated in the first place. And we find asking this question is one of the first things that often employers actually forget to do. And when we get engaged from a legal point of view, one of the first questions we ask is, well, what is the actual reason that the employee actually suggested this or has this initial position? Now, if the employee has provided a legitimate reason for not being vaccinated, and examples of that include existing medical condition, then other options should be made available. Now, whether disciplinary action is reasonable will depend on the circumstance. And there is information on disciplinary action for refusing to be vaccinated. Stand downs are unlikely to be available option for employers if an employee refuses this direction. But again, there are quite specific procedures around standing down employees in certain situations as well. And more than happy to take questions on that if people want to explore that a bit more as well too in the question and answer part of the session. Employers generally don't otherwise have the power to suspend employees without pay unless an enterprise or other registered agreement or award or employment contract follows them to do so. Now, with it, one of the issues that we also then see is, can an employer require an employee to be vaccinated? Employee to provide evidence that they've been vaccinated. Now, this takes the question to the next level down. So that way you've said, right, yes, we require employees to be vaccinated, but now we want you to prove that you actually have done that and show us the evidence that you've done that as well too. Now, if an employer has provided a lawful and reasonable direction to be vaccinated, the employer could ask the employee to provide evidence of their vaccination as well. And this is the part that we've actually suggested that you keep registers of your vaccinations as well. Now, where an employer wants to direct an employee to provide the evidence, essentially the employer should make that the requirement to provide evidence is also lawful and reasonable. Now, with it, there are some legal directions that we have around this as well, especially where directing an employee to provide evidence of vaccination is likely to raise privacy issues. So essentially what we have started working with agencies on, and I will just show you this here, is to essentially, when you jump in to your JMB dashboard using the login details here, it'll take you into your HR profile. And once clicking on that, essentially what you then have is the staff profile under My Info that you can see. And let me just log in to show you where this is for agencies. But essentially what it gives you is the register information. And I'll just bring this up again once you go into the HR profile. And essentially staff can actually go into My Info and actually load it directly in under, and what we've just put in here is the vaccination register that staff can essentially utilize. Now, going back around this, you can require employees to provide evidence of this. And obviously the question that comes out of this is, what happens if an employee refuses to be vaccinated? Can you require evidence about why they've actually refused? So it's the reverse of what we've just spoken about. Now, if an employer has provided lawful direction to an employee to be vaccinated and the employee refuses, then the employer could also ask the employee to provide evidence of their reason for refusal. And essentially, this can include, as stated above, medical information or the likes, or also a form of what we'd say is a doctor's certificate or other information for the employee to provide back to you. So you can actually ask for this information. What this actually looks like has not been mandated by Fair Work, but equally we suggest that if you do hold this position, then you can request further information on this as well. So you can see with a lot of these questions from an HR point of view, there is a lot to actually consider around this. And initially, some of these very initial questions open up a bit of a Pandora's box, but we are working through these and we will actually send this material out. I can see that a number of people have requested that we do forward all of these slides out today, which we certainly will do for yourselves as well. We do also repeat that if you are watching this webinar via our recording and you wanted copies of these slides, then by all means, please contact us and we're happy to get these out to you as well too. So can an employee refuse to attend the workplace because a co-worker isn't vaccinated against coronavirus? And this was something that no doubt may come up within your agency. It's already come up within some of the agencies that we're supporting at the moment and providing advice on. At present, assuming that there is no public health order preventing attendance, it is unlikely that an employee could actually refuse to attend the workplace where a co-worker isn't vaccinated against coronavirus. Now, the background of this is because the vaccination is not mandatory in most workplaces and won't require their employees to be vaccinated. And the second reason provided through Fair Work is that the co-worker may have a legitimate reason not to be vaccinated. For example, what we just said was under a medical condition. So if an employee refuses to attend your agency because a co-worker isn't vaccinated, then the employer can direct them to attend the workplace if direction is lawful and reasonable. Now, on this, we have then looked at this as a, I'm going to say, exemption to this, where people have then turned around and said, well, hang on, our state departments have actually provided direction to say you should work from home where you can. And even if there is a increasing of 50% or so return to workforce, then surely we're entitled to work from home if we can. Now, this is where it starts to get quite complex around, I'll call it the general COVID laws and workplace laws, because there are a multitude of different things to actually consider in this circumstance. For most employers, to keep it simple, the direction is that you can provide direction to a directive. You can provide a directive to employees to attend the workplace as well, where it is lawful and reasonable to do so. And certainly we found that in a number of agencies. Now, obviously coming out of all of this is, what do you do if an employer, if an employee refuses to get vaccinated? What are the disciplinary options that might be available to you? Now, an employer like yourselves may be able to take disciplinary action, including actually termination of an employment against an employee for refusing to be vaccinated, if there is a lawful and reasonable direction requiring vaccination. And this is what we have discussed in all the previous slides. Now, this will actually be based on individual facts and certain circumstances. It will also look at things like enterprise agreements, other registered agreements, awards, contracts, workplace policy, which I mentioned before as well too, and also if there is a public health order around this. Now, Fair Work have suggested that agencies like yourself should also consider getting legal advice in these circumstances. What we've been working with agencies on across this is to set up some of the systems and information, so that way you're already having up-to-date workplace policies. You're looking at where you may need to revising employment contracts, trying to avoid some of these issues, so that way hopefully you don't have to be in a situation where you're terminating staff around this. But if you do need to, then obviously what are the options, and being very mindful of both the employees and also your agency's requirements as well too. So one of the areas that is now also coming up and causing a lot of discussion is around anti-discrimination laws. And you might have seen this in the news, especially around the anti-vax campaigns as well, where people are talking about anti-discrimination laws and issues that these are now causing. So let's explore what these anti-discrimination laws are about. Now, it's important that your agency considers your obligations under and responsibilities under anti-discrimination laws. Now, essentially what these do is prohibit discrimination against employees in the workplace based on protected characteristics. Now, what those protected characteristics include is things like disability, pregnancy, or religious beliefs. So essentially you can't discriminate against those people with a disability, pregnant, or religious beliefs in this circumstance. And it's important that you consider to to be aware of that. We are aware that there are some agencies that have raised issues on religious beliefs, and we've had to explore that a lot further, especially where some of the religious beliefs appear to have recently changed as well too, and what impact that has on employees and employers and the likes. So with it, before requesting employees to be vaccinated, you do need to consider some of these broader provisions around that. And that's what we've said, looking at your policies and COVID vaccination policies for your agency is the way to essentially manage these obligations. Now, the other questions that people come up with is, okay, we've dealt with current employees. What about prospective employees? Can we require them to be vaccinated before starting work? Now, in most circumstances, agencies can and may be able to require prospective employees to be vaccinated against coronavirus. You should equally consider your obligations and responsibilities carefully. For example, under general protections, like we've just spoken about, anti-discrimination laws, before requiring that a prospective employee be vaccinated before commencing employment. Now, on this, with these workplace arrangements, and this sort of creates a segue into what other agencies have done and how they're starting to manage some of these discussions. Now, two agencies that we just wanted to focus on, one was Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative, and we thank Laurie Seville, the Chief Operating Officer out there, and also Women's Housing, and we acknowledge Judy Lyon, the Chief Executive Officer, and Lena Tompkinson. Now, part of this is around monitoring your staff and looking at what support systems you should have in place. We have covered the HR and vaccination obligations and rules around this, and there is, as you can see, a lot of grey area that your agency needs to consider. That said, when we look at systems around lockdowns and rolling lockdowns that states and territories have been quite clear that they're going to use, well, what systems do you still need to have in place to ensure that your staff are kept safe around systems that you have? And so essentially, we've covered these off in the past, but I wanted to start to move into what are the systems that your agencies should be having. Essentially, one of the main parts is around workplace attendance registers. Now, essentially what we see here on your screen, and I'll just bring this up, is essentially the workplace registers that agencies have. So where we've just moved in from, and I'll just bring this back around this, is the two agencies that we're just going to focus on is Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative and also Women's Housing. Now, some of the workplace systems that they've actually put in to manage staff and workflows is around attendance registers using QR codes, and also staff registers in terms of managing people's vaccinations and the likes. So the first part that we're just going to look at is around workflows and attendance registers. So essentially, many of you would be using either event or workplace registers like you see at the top. These are the sorts of sheets where it records time, date, person's name, and where they might have visited if it's a specific site. And that effectively gets registered as almost a daily report. And that's being placed into the JMB system side. A lot of agencies are actually using QR codes. And again, you can use the JMB app to essentially do this. If you like, you can actually try this out and actually take a photo using your iPhone as well, sorry, your mobile device, it doesn't have to be an iPhone, of the QR code. And what you'll find is that it brings up the same attendance register information. The difference here is that what we do see is that it asks a series of questions around this. Now, when we talk of HR, workplace rules, COVID vaccinations, all of this is around keeping staff and clients safe. So with it, one of the questions that you do see, and if you use the QR code, you can actually take a photo of it. It'll open up automatically on your phone. It's a test site that we use for women's housing services, and essentially answer the questions of what's there. Now, what that does is automatically flows directly into the contact tracing button on, in this case, the women's housing site. Now, we have just received a couple of questions from people attending late today, just saying, hi, I've arrived late. Will the presentation be made available? And that's from Napoleon. Yes, it certainly will be. And we will be sending out all of this information to you along with the vaccination and HR legal information as well. So essentially what this does is allows you to log in and create the information and details that you want to see on your own register. Now, with this, what you'll find is that once you do that, it'll give you your contact tracing information. And we've set these up as well too for our own firm as well too, and it allows us to essentially register that information. This is all consistent with essentially the relevant state departments. And why we say this is because a number of state departments, you can see up here, talk about daily attestation, where staff that work in health and community service agencies are required to provide a daily attestation or a submission that they are actually COVID-free. And so this form allows you to essentially do that when you go in. Equally, you can still use your attendance registers. Now, part of that also on your dashboard, which we've spoken about previously, and we're actually going to look at all of these systems next week, is essentially to have their assessments, their working from home, their workstation assessments, and cleaning registers online. Now, we have just been asked a really important question, and it's from the CEO at one of the migrant resource centers, who was also, and I'll recognize this, the chair of the board in the past as well too. And the question is, would it be appropriate for the board to pass a resolution to require all staff who will have to work with frail and elderly people must be inoculated against COVID-19 and show proof in order to continue their employment with the organization? And the short answer to that is yes. The more detailed response around it is that it would be only by an exception around either medical or other exemptions, such as anti-discrimination laws around it. But the general rule would be yes, and essentially a agency-wide policy would be the position to take on this. Now, the reason that we say that is because under it is essentially frontline workers that are providing services to people that are frail and elderly. And we've seen that already in aged care and community service agencies, where a person that isn't inoculated or has a vaccine, the COVID vaccine, essentially was described as a super spreader, where they worked with a multiple number of agencies and caused the pandemic to spread quite dramatically in the sector last year. So I think that would be based on what we've just said, and the question is, just to repeat it, would it be appropriate for the board to pass a resolution to require all staff who will have to work with frail elderly people to be inoculated against COVID-19 and show proof in order to continue their employment with the organization? And certainly, I think the position would be fair to say, yes, it is as well too. And so on that, what we have also, just moving back to something I will mention here, is that on the dashboard itself, and you can see under your JMB HR module, that essentially what you do have is the capability for staff to actually place in their own vaccination register and actually upload it themselves. And they can do that directly from their mobile device as well and bring that into the system for you. Now, in saying that, importantly, the registers of people and where they work, we can see that right across the board. Agencies like Rumballara and Women's Housing that have actually been involved in a number of hotspots. They also Rumballara provides a diverse range of health and community services, but also aged care services to the Rumballara Elders facility. And again, they've got these systems in place, which is some of the things that we're starting to speak about already. And you'll find these in your JMB dashboard around this. So you've got copies of your disaster COVID plan in your disaster module. You've got your policies, you've got your staff training, you've got your pandemic forms around your daily assessments, which more and more staff are actually using across different agencies, as well as monitoring HR registers as well and training information. Similarly, the policies list that Rumballara uses is quite consistent across a lot of agencies. And we've seen the same thing work in other groups like Women's Housing. And they've got exactly the same system, which has worked incredibly well for them and positioned them to manage their HR systems. And we're actually going to look at next week client record systems of what information you need to hold on to for staff and volunteers, but also client information as well, and where that information should be located. You will find all of these forms, and if we jump into your JMB dashboard, and I'll just do that now for you, so you will be taken to our website. You can access that by clicking on the quick login button. Once you do that, we'll send you your username and password if you don't have that already. You will find your COVID assessment forms on the left-hand side here. So for example, if we bring up the COVID daily assessment form, you can see that we've got some test data in this site because that's our demo site that we're using. And you can actually click on adding a new entry, and that will bring up your daily attestation form that staff need to fill out. And we're going to go through this in detail next week. Equally, the other parts of the system that we're going to look at is around the HR side and also the contact tracing information for your QR codes and also your client record advocacy notes and where that information gets placed, along with contacting people via the network profile as well. So we are going to look at how you actually roll this out to your staff. With this, you will get your login details again into JMB. If you do have any questions around this, then you can contact us. In terms of recommendations moving forwards, what we do suggest you do is review your COVID safe policies. And we recognize Brian's question in relation to board passing a resolution. Certainly that's the case on looking at your COVID safe policies along with your HR legal compliance obligations, as we covered off in today's session. And also start to look at your HR registers and client information in what you're actually recording. If you do have any questions, by all means, please contact our law firm on this number listed, or you do have my mobile listed as well too. Next week, we will be looking at implementation of the HR COVID safe systems, including the client relationship management obligations and also networking and getting information out to staff as well too. If you do have any questions, by all means, please contact us on the numbers listed here. And by all means, if you are listening to this and watching this webinar through our YouTube channel, please reach out to us if you do have any questions. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We will stay online now and answer any questions that people might have. In this case, we will switch off the recording and thank people for listening to us online.